Near the end of the blockbuster movie Gandhi, there's a scene where, and the setting is that this is after independence, and Pakistan and India have separated, and there's rioting has broken out between Hindus and Muslims primarily. And as an attempt to bring an end to that rioting, Gandhi has gone on a fast, a hunger strike, if you will. And he's dying, basically, because this has gone on for quite a while. And so it's now to the point where people are trying to convince him to stop. And in one scene, a group of people are come and gathered who have been involved in the rioting and have said, we're going to stop. But one of the a man comes forward and says, he just can't do it because he's so filled with hate. His son was killed by, he's Hindu, and his son was killed by Muslim rioters. And Gandhi, lying on his bed, barely able to talk, says, I know a cure for that. He says to him, find a Muslim boy who has lost his parents in the riots and adopt him and raise him as your own. His eyes are kind of a little big. Then he says, and raise him to be a good Muslim. Forgiveness. Tough. How many times should I forgive? Peter says. 7 times? 77 times, Jesus says. Or another textual version says 70 times 7. Without end, in other words. I spoke earlier about trying to find the voice, the authentic voice of Jesus in our readings, because we know that there's other voices that get mixed in there. Well, our gospel today is about as close, I think, as we can expect to get to the authentic voice of Jesus. It is both authentic and profound. Now, your high school English teacher, if you turned this in as a short story, would have marked the beginning of it with lots of red, and usually probably the word lame would have appeared somewhere, And Peter came to Jesus and said, okay, so we have no setting for this, which is typical of these stories. Mostly what we know is that these stories were just kind of collected independently, and that perhaps with Mark, for the first time, they were put into some kind of a story context so that there's a plot, there's a development to it. But a lot of them have this just kind of plunked in sense to them like this. But it's a great parable that Jesus tells. As he says, let me tell you about a king. This is his once upon a time. The kingdom of God is like. This is Jesus' version of once upon a time. So a king calls his slaves to account. Now, the story seems pretty accurate as far as we can tell about society of that time, economics of that time. We know that in the Roman Empire, generally, huge portions of the population were slaves. I mean, we're not supposed to imagine, Gone with the Wind with the slaves being, black people out in the fields. Slaves were interracial, and they were everywhere in society. And so the slave that is referenced in this story probably was one of the king's primary advisors. The way the system worked was basically it was a pyramid. And the king, of course, is mainly interested in getting lots of money. And he uses this pyramid of slaves to collect money. And the money gradually works its way up. And the way in which the people who are doing this make their own living is by they skim just a little bit of those collections off for themselves. And so now we get to this person who probably is like the number 1 or number 2 slave. And it would seem that he's been skimming just a little bit too much off of that. And the king says, you owe me a whole lot of money. And the amount here is like fantastic. I mean, it's just unimaginable. This is like a national debt, not like a personal debt. I mean, it would be absolutely impossible to pay. So Jesus is putting us into that kind of a scenario where things are just blown way out of proportion. Okay. But in any case, the point is this slave has a debt that's absolutely impossible to pay. So the king's going to sell him and his family off and at least get a little money out of him. But the man falls on his knees. Please, I'll pay you it all. Yeah, right. Okay. But the king kind of ignores that and focuses in on the plea for grace, for forgiveness. And so the king says, all right, I'll forgive you all of the debt. this astronomical, unimaginable debt. I just forgive it. It's gone. End of story. Goodbye. So the man goes along, and he encounters a fellow slave, probably somebody below him who is sending money up to him, and this guy owes him some money. Now, it's not a meager amount. Let's say it's a couple $100, okay? But it's nothing like what the guy was just forgiven. And the story says he grabs him by the throat and says, "Pay me what you owe. Oh, please forgive me." I mean, he almost uses the exact same words that the first slave does. I'll pay it all back. And he will hear nothing of it, turns him in, says, "You're going to go to debtor's prison. Goodbye." Well, this is all this way, these great stories. His fellow slaves see this and are horrified. And so they go and whisper to the king, "Do you know what your slave just did?" King meets guy, and of course we get the very predictable conclusion. Everybody sees it coming, right? "I forgave you this huge amount. How could you not have forgiven your fellow slave this small amount? And I'm going to throw you into the prison, and you're going to be tortured until you can pay this all back." Now, at the very end here, I suspect we might not be hearing the voice of Jesus. I talk about Matthew as cranky Matthew. When Matthew rolls around, unfortunately every 3 years, I kind of roll my eyes going, okay, I can do this again. Matthew's kind of a grouch, okay? He's just not happy. I'm not a real happy man. I mean, there's some great things in Matthew, however. But he's often has this kind of edge to him where he has to push things just a little further than they need to go, so the poor guy needs to be tortured. Doesn't really make sense in the story, because I mean, if he's in prison being tortured, how is he going to be able to repay this debt? So my guess is Matthew's maybe just kind of twisting the knife a little bit. But if it is Jesus, it says how important this message is to him. And it's really important. It's also rather surprising. Because when you think about it, logically, there's no reason why, because this man has been forgiven all this debt, that now the debts owed to him should be wiped away, right? What's happened? Why are these debts now no longer payable? They apparently are genuine, legitimate. He ought to get his pay, right? But Jesus is obviously making the point that there's something more than logic and judgment and law involved here. There's something called grace. Grace. Recently, I learned about a concept that has stuck with me and I think helps make some sense of this. It comes from a French word, and the English version is almost identical, and we'll just use it, which is resentment. One of the surprising things about Jesus, when you look at the Gospels carefully, is that he doesn't really talk about God all that much, or spirituality, or what it means to be a godly person in those kind of, inner sense. How do I connect my soul with God? That's not really a big topic for him. Jesus is mostly interested about human relationships, about how people get along with each other or not. And this word resentment summarizes very well what Jesus often focuses in on, which is those reactive emotions, those negative reactive emotions that block our relationships. And if you want a simple example, just think of what happens within your car. Almost any trip, however short, is going to end up in some kind of resentment, right? I mean, when those people cut you off, when the guy's going too slow, when he's running the stop sign, or she or he, it doesn't matter. Oh my gosh, the emotions that happen in the course of a simple trip to the grocery store can be really quite amazing. And the parking lot, of course, is the worst of all, right? I mean, the Trader Joe's parking lot in Santa Fe is just insane. Anyway, but that's what resentment is about. Those emotions that come up when that's when somebody does something to us, and we get really ticked, right? Well, it doesn't just happen in those kind of simple places. But think of the author that brought this to me by the name of Don Cupid. He's an English theologian. Here's a list he compiles of examples of resentment. Wariness, suspicion, doubt, hesitation, mistrust, touchiness, scorn, disgust, dislike, envy, lust, disapproval, repugnance, contempt, impatience, malice, irritation, anger, rage, fury, fear, terror, hatred, boredom. I thought that was interesting, a reaction to another person. Indifference, recoiling, seething resentment, begrudging, outrage, indignation at, despair of, and many, many more. I think I could easily run up 50 or 60. It really is astonishing that such a large range of negative emotional reactions to another person can and do surge up in us and make us all desire to put as much distance as possible between that person and ourselves. Jesus is very aware of these things, and this is what he is asking us to be aware of in ourselves. Because the key is that in that story is not just, he doesn't just calmly sit the man down and say, no, you owed me this money, you need to pay it. No, it's that he grabs him by the throat. Seeing him triggers something in him. Perhaps that forgiveness that he received from the king, perhaps somehow diminished his own view of himself, right? That he had gotten into such debt that it had to be given, and now he feels himself smaller as a person. He's been now indebted to the king. And so he sees this man that owes him something, and it brings up that rage, that guilt, that embarrassment. And now he's going to bring that judgment down upon this poor other slave. But these kind of emotions are what involve us in so many things. As I've been thinking about this, I realize how many times little things will set me off. And I'm going, and it's so easy to dwell on them. We love dwelling on them, don't we? You know, we think about that. We'll think about that thing that happened in the car for hours. That guy just cut me off. He didn't pay any attention to me. One of the things that Jesus also understands is that most resentment is justified. He shouldn't have cut me off. He shouldn't have ran that stop sign. That parking space was mine, and he knew it. Or all of those things that happen in our workplace, in our neighborhood, in our families. We had this discussion on Tuesday morning. I said, I can't remember how many funerals I've had where family members have come together and for the first time had to talk to each other because some fight happened who knows how many years ago, and they're still seething about it. But now they've got to resolve it, at least for a moment. That question that Rodney King asked so many years ago still echoes across. Can't we all get along? It's tough. It's tough. Jesus says, let it go. Let it go. Simply out of grace. Really? Really? Because the whole point of the story is that we are all that slave. We've all been forgiven everything, right? Nothing is held against us, however religiously or secularly you want to put that. God holds nothing against us. The universe holds nothing against us. We're all justified. In the air we breathe, in the space we take up, it's all okay. We screw up, we make mistakes, we are forgiven. We pick ourselves up and go on. And the same is true for all of our fellow human beings. As Paul says, as Luther re-emphasized, we're justified by grace, by the sheer gift of love. And we live simply by trusting that, by faith. Yeah, all sounds good on paper. How do we make it real? Well, Jesus just says we do it. We do it, but we do it by continually recentering ourselves on our own status. That fact that we, too, live purely by grace. Now, so much of our world, so much of our culture tells us something else. Oh, no, you earn everything that you have, right? right? That's why we go to work every day. We earn it. Yes, it's mine. I deserve it. And so when someone somehow takes it from me, well, they've got to pay it back. There's an injustice been done. And that may be the most controversial thing about what Jesus is talking about here. Because Jesus puts peace, in the Hebrew Bible, shalom, he puts that ahead of justice. Because Jesus says your peaceful, loving relationship is more important than settling scores, than evening the balances, than getting paid back. That's, again, a pretty countercultural idea. That can be hard, very hard for us to hear. And that's one that I'm struggling with myself and trying to understand just how it is that that's applied in our day, because we live in a world that's filled with injustice, right? So are we saying, well, those people just need to get over it? At one level, Jesus kind of is. But I think he's talking about us in our individual personal relationships. That's where he's really coming down and focusing. Let it go. Let it go. Compassion for Jesus is the primary motivation for our life. Forgiveness, how many times? Endlessly. Endlessly. That coworker in my office that drives me absolutely crazy, forgive her. Forgive him. Let it go. And you go back on Monday morning and they're still there. Let it go. We can't settle scores. We can't find the balance. It never ends. It never ends. Again, same author talking about how awful this is. In short, as we found earlier, Jesus' view is that resentment is so strong, irrational, easily displaced, that we cannot check its poisonous, destructive effects by an ethic of law and strict justice alone. A touch of pure grace, gratuitous generosity of spirit is what's needed. Without it, human beings are lost and will stay lost. In our own world, the point is very familiar to negotiators who are struggling to make peace between two communities who have been bitterly hostile to each other for centuries. Each community clings tenaciously to its own story of cherished grievances. I love that phrase. Justified retaliation, and so on. To make peace, you must persuade many people who've had bad memories to be almost supernaturally big and generous and go beyond justice. It's a lot to ask, but it has to be done. Without that touch of absurd love, nothing can be done to make peace between hostile communities. That's what Gandhi understands. That story of his life is just so amazing. How he forces people to confront their hate, their anger, and says, we will not survive if that is what is in our soul. Our lives are pure gift. We don't owe anyone for it. We don't need to make any apologies. It's hard for us to accept that. It's hard to accept anyone's love, let alone God's love. And our relationships have to be the same. We simply give our love freely, gratuitously, without expecting anything in return. We forgive whenever we're asked. We love, we forgive, we let go. And we keep on moving on. Amen.